Welcome to this press conference with the Correctional Investigator at the National Press Theatre. Bienvenue au Théâtre National de la Presse avec l'enquêteur. Whenever you're ready, you can start.
Bonjour. Je voudrais remercier la Tribune de la Presse.
Greetings, and first I'd like to thank the Parliamentary Press Gallery for having us.
That we are gathered here today on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationship between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous people and their culture. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuits, Métis, First Nation people who call this land home. Yesterday, my annual report was tabled before Parliament. This is the office's 50th annual report and my 7th as Correctional Investigator of Canada. The report includes the second of a two-part update of the office's original 2013 special report to Parliament entitled Spirit Matters. I am very honored to host this press conference, and I'm humbled to share this stage with leaders of the three national Indigenous organizations representing the voice, rights, and interests of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people in Canada. Representing Inuit Tapirit Katanami, I am pleased to introduce President Nathan Obed. Seated next to him is Cassidy Caron, President of the Métis National Council. Representing the Assembly of First Nation is Regional Chief of the Assembly of First Nation for Quebec-Labrador, Monsieur Ghislain Picard. Following a few opening remarks, I will invite each of these distinguished leaders to make their own statement reflecting on the report's implication of the people and nations they represent. Today I stand with First Nation, Métis, and Inuit leaders to call on the federal government to acknowledge on the crisis of overrepresentation of Indigenous people in Canadian prisons. 10 years ago, when the office's original Spirit Matters was tabled in Parliament, Indigenous people represented 23% of the overall federal incarcerated population. Today, the proportion of Indigenous people in federal custody has reached 32%. Even more alarming, Indigenous women now account for half of all women in Canadian penitentiaries. This is not a new issue. For many years now, my office has been sounding the alarm. The discriminatory treatment of Indigenous persons in federal custody was among the first set of issues raised by my office when it was created 50 years ago. In the decades that follow, my office has issued more than 70 recommendations specific to Indigenous corrections. Sadly, most of these calls have gone unanswered. I acknowledge that Canada's correctional authorities does not have solely control and decide who enters federal penitentiaries. At the same time, on nearly every measure of correctional performance, whether time spent behind bars before first release, overrepresentation in maximum security, placement in the new administrative segregation regime, higher reoffending rates, higher rates of suicide attempts and self-injury. The gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in federal custody continues to widen. It is difficult to escape the conclusion that the correctional system perpetuates conditions of disadvantage and discrimination that contributes to such a disproportional incarceration rate. For this report, my office sets out to document the voice, lived experience, and testimony of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people living and working inside the federal correctional system. It is one of the most ambitious, challenging, and complex investigations ever conducted by my office. Informed by Indigenous insight and perspective, the evidence that Canada's correctional system is failing Indigenous people could not be any more clear. First, 10 years after Spirit Matters, my investigation found that only one new community Section 81 healing lodge has been created. There are still no healing lodges in the Ontario or Atlantic regions, and none in the north. Moreover, state-run healing lodges are better funded, staffed, and resourced than Indigenous-run Section 81 healing lodges. Second, elders who contract their services to Correctional Services of Canada told us that their contributions are neither properly respected nor valued by their employer. They are not treated or paid the same as their chaplain counterparts. Thirdly, with respect to Pathways program, that's a penitentiary-based intervention for Indigenous people, we found that only the most engaged, committed of candidates is able to meet the entry requirements. As a result, at any one time, Pathways serves less than 8% of the total Indigenous in-custody population. And finally, our investigation found that most Indigenous people under sentence never actually participated in or benefit from the Indigenous continuum of care intervention established in their name. Less than 3% of the annual expenditure on correction is actually dedicated to Indigenous initiatives. En menant cette enquête, je suis parvenu à la conclusion.
This investigation allowed me to conclude that the Canadian correctional system retains many features and notions rooted in colonialism. There is not a shadow of a doubt that the correctional system itself contributes to the marginalization, the criminalization, and the over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples. If it is to implement the urgent and necessary reforms recommended in my report, Canada will have to own up to its colonial heritage, adopt an approach based on cultural distinctions so that it may work with First Nations Métis and Inuit, and truly commit to reconciliation. With this in mind, I deliberately directed many of my recommendations to the Minister of Public Safety, the person best placed to impose conditions on the correctional system and enforce them. My report echoes previous calls to the federal government, asking for it to transfer, to give Indigenous communities and organizations more thorough authority and resources, as well as greater control over the care and oversight of Indigenous detainees. Specifically, I am calling for a new funding model for Section 81 healing lodges, so that these institutions may reach funding parity with federally run facilities. I also call upon the government to transfer the control and ownership of state-run healing lodges to Indigenous communities, as was originally envisioned. In order to ensure equity and justice, the federal government must ensure greater job security, pay, and benefits to elders working in the penitentiary system.
Canada makes good on the many repeated calls to action and commitments to reduce overrepresentation by implementing an Indigenous decarceration strategy, the general aim of which would be to reallocate resources from penitentiaries to community-based reintegration efforts. At this time, I would like to invite each leader at this table to make an introductory statement before we take question, and I will start with President Obed.
Nakomik, thank you, Dr. Zinger and Ulakut. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to recognize Regional Chief Picard and also President Garin in the work that we do on this really difficult issue. But let me first acknowledge and support your work and the findings of the Correctional Investigator and the annual report that was just tabled in the House of Commons. And right away, what we are struck by is the ongoing overrepresentation of Inuit, as well as First Nations and Métis, in federal corrections. And also what we have been saying for decades now is this over-incarceration has a direct link to basic lack of necessities and needs being met in our communities, specifically in education, health, and wellness. Our high poverty rates, our inadequate housing, our lack of access to healthcare services, our challenges in relation to poverty and food security all play into what we are seeing. Investments in poverty reduction, housing, education, our justice systems, food security, our investments in crime prevention, and our position has been and continues to be that upstream investments in Inuit socioeconomic equity in this country will lead to healthier, prosperous, safer communities and decrease the rate of representation in federal corrections with Inuit. We've also worked very specifically on murdered and missing Inuit women and girls and 2S LGBTQIA peoples. And there's significant overlap between the recommendations of this report and the Inuit-led actions within ITK's National Inuit Action Plan on Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. It supports community releases under sections 81 and 84 and Inuit-specific programming. CSC must work directly with ITK to create and implement rehabilitative programs. This leads me to the last substantive point I'd like to make here this morning, which is in relation to Inuit-specific programs. There continues to be a lack of Inuit-specific programming across CSC and in federal corrections. ITK would like to see more Inuit-specific classification tools, which are used to determine security rating impacting programming opportunities. Current tools have been a barrier for Inuit in accessing programming and release opportunities, and often result in a higher security classification for Inuit. We can't address justice effectively without tackling systemic racism. The National Inuit Action Plan also calls for mandatory training in several areas: anti-racism, cultural competence, trauma-informed services, and gender-based violence. We also know that language is a key consideration in rehabilitation, and the lack of Inuktitut as a federally recognized official language then leads to a complete lack of Inuktitut being used systemically within the federal prison system. We need more Inuktitut services beyond just the very wonderful services that are provided by those who are those Inuit who are helping, whether it's elders or whether it's other Inuit who are part of the rehabilitative and programming process within CSC today. Also, your point around Section 81 healing lodges, there are no Section 81 healing lodges in Inuit Nunangat. While building new facilities for federal corrections are not our primary focus, we do have an urgent need to ensure that Inuit who are federally incarcerated have options for their rehabilitation and release in a way that is culturally respectful and does link into the ability for a person to have a chance of integrating back into society and into Inuit communities. Nakumik.
Tansei Kyo. Good morning, everybody. My name is Cassidy Karen. I'm the president of the Métis National Council. The Métis National Council is the recognized national and international voice of the Métis Nation, represented by Métis governments in the provinces of British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario. I'm pleased to be joining this press conference today to be speaking on this very important topic and issue that we continue to face. And I want to thank Dr. Zinger for the hard work that you've put into this report and the dedication that you have in highlighting the specific issues that Indigenous peoples continue to face today. I also want to recognize and thank my colleagues, President Obed and Regional Chief Picard, for being here with me today. The findings in Dr. Zinger's report that was tabled in Parliament yesterday are certainly startling, but they're not surprising. The report really does confirm what the Métis Nation has known for a long time, and that is that the colonial correctional system does not work for us as Métis people. Dr. Zinger's findings overwhelmingly support the conclusion that the status quo is insufficient to address the needs and realities of Métis people in federal correctional institutions. The rise in overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples over the past decade is truly and extremely concerning, and systemic change is necessary to address the status quo of overrepresentation and programming that does not speak or does not work for Métis people right now. We support the calls for this systemic change. The differential treatment of elders that was also documented in the report was also and particularly concerning. Canada must respect its own laws on human rights and employment standards. Under the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, elders are guaranteed the same status as chaplains and other religious leaders, and it's not acceptable for potential violations of the Canadian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, the Canadian Human Rights Act, or the Canada Labour Code to continue. We also note that elder programs and services must be consistent with the rights enumerated in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples relating to medicines and intellectual property. If we are serious about talking about and actually implementing this change and serious about eliminating overrepresentation of Indigenous people and Métis people specifically for the Métis Nation, it is our Métis governments who need to be empowered to act. They are best placed to respond to the needs and realities of their citizens. The pan-Indigenous programming that's noted in the report can actually erode cultural connections to communities, and the findings are clear for the need for and successes of the distinctions-based approach. It's encouraging to hear recommendations for co-developed funding processes. Any such processes must respect Métis Nation governance structures and that distinctions-based nation-to-nation, Inuit Crown, government-to-government relationship. The lack of long-term funding, sustainable funding, must be remedied in order to address the ongoing representation of Indigenous peoples in the criminal justice system by Canada's federal, provincial, and territorial governments. We are supportive of a decarceration strategy that aims to reallocate resources from colonial institutions to community-based reintegration efforts. And again, it must be co-developed and implemented with Métis governments to ensure that incarcerated Métis are supported in their communities. In the United Nations Declaration the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act and the action plan that was tabled just this past June, Canada committed to completing a justice and policing sub-accord with the Métis Nation, the objectives of which include ending overrepresentation, reducing recidivism rates, ensuring preventative and culturally responsive approaches, and advancing rights to self-determination and self-government. And we look forward to continuing this work with the Government of Canada so that we can achieve these goals. Finally, addressing overrepresentation will require preventative approaches that keep Indigenous peoples out of the colonial justice system. As President Obed just mentioned, that upstream investments are definitely necessary to keep people out of the system first and foremost. While robust implementation of Dr. Zinger's recommendations will help improve conditions for incarcerated Métis, Inuit, and First Nations, there must be actions to keep Indigenous peoples out of the justice system in the first place. Thank you, Marcy.
Bonjour
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here today with the Dr. Zinger, the correctional investigator, who is finally making public his very troubling findings on the correctional system in Canada. This morning, we heard that there remains a far too high proportion of Indigenous peoples and the First Nations in particular in the correctional system.
Certainly want to acknowledge as well that we are on the ancestral unceded territory of the Algonquin people. And first and foremost, I want to thank Dr. Zinger for inviting us to stand by him, with him this morning for these very disturbing conclusions. And I certainly want to acknowledge as well my colleagues from the other NIOs, President Obed and President Carroll. And I share with my colleague from British Columbia, Regional Chief TG, the portfolio of justice and policing. So I want to thank Dr. Zinger for inviting us to talk about the implications of the Office of the Correctional Investigator's findings and recommendations for First Nations people and communities. I also want to thank you and your team, Dr. Zinger, for the thorough investigation conducted by your office, from your office, to hear the voices of First Nations people living and working inside the federal correctional system. The Canadian justice system and correctional institutions are rooted within colonial systems that result in systemic injustices, which include the over-representation, over-incarceration of First Nations peoples. The AFN is dedicated to supporting regional and community-based, self-determined, and holistic approaches to justice that are grounded in First Nations principles, protocols, laws, and traditions, including ensuring the framework is consistent with the minimum standards as set out in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It is disheartening, deeply, deeply concerning to see that 10 years after the Spirit Matters report was released, the situation has only gotten worse. I support the recommendations of the Correctional Investigators report because I believe that these recommendations can lead to significant improvement in Section 81 healing lodges, pathways units, and elder supports in federal institutions, and reallocate funding to our communities. When you consider the findings of the report illustrating that there is a two-tier system of community-run, underfunded healing lodges being compared to correctional services Canada-run healing lodges, the only reasonable explanation is that systemic racism continues in correctional institutions. The AFN welcomes the recommendations that the control and ownership of existing state-run healing lodges be transferred to First Nations and their institutions. As self-governing nations, we know how best to support First Nations people while they are in custody and upon their release. We agree with the finding that it is necessary to redirect funding from Correctional Services Canada to Indigenous communities. We know that true healing for First Nations peoples must come from the grassroots level. Community-driven approaches to address the root causes of criminal behavior facilitate healing and provide support for First Nations peoples upon release from custody are necessary to curb the alarming number of our peoples in federal prisons. It is very concerning to see that our elders are being undervalued, underpaid, and undersupported while working in federal institutions, that they are being paid less than their counterparts. Our elders deserve more respect than that. The recommendations for more job security and additional funding and other supports for elders are positive steps to acknowledge the vital contributions they make to assist First Nations people in federal custody in profound ways. It is important that First Nations peoples have access to pathways initiatives while serving time in federal custody. I agree with the recommendation that the barriers that make these units inaccessible for some offenders should be removed. We fully support the correctional investigators' call for a decarceration strategy. A distinctions-based national Indigenous decarceration strategy co-developed with First Nations is absolutely needed. Immediate action must be taken to address the over-incarceration of First Nations people, or the problem will only continue to get worse. We can't afford to come back 10 years from now to hear the crisis situation has only gotten worse again. This has to change. We need to start heading in a direction that supports thriving and safe First Nations.
We'll be happy to take some questions now.
Thank you. We'll now start the question period. As a reminder, one question, one follow-up. Brad Forrester, CBC.
Hello, my question is for Correctional Investigator Zinger. You hinted at this a little bit in your remarks in French. Your findings about the CSC's culture when it comes to Indigenous people are quite negative. You wrote that there's an organizational paternalism there, an incapacity for self-reflection, and you also worry about what you describe as this game of recognition politics that's being played within there, where essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, the CSC has learned to talk the talk when it comes to reconciliation, but hasn't actually taken any action. So taking those findings on their face, do you believe the CSC is capable of implementing these recommendations, or do you believe the minister is going to have to step in and get a handle on this?
I've been working with the Office of the Correctional Investigator for many, many years now, about 18 years so far. And we've made recommendations after recommendations, and I mentioned that prior to this report, we made over 70 recommendations. And I must say that it is quite disappointing that the service has failed to take at heart those recommendations and do some of the exercise necessary of self-reflection and taking if you want, a step outside to look at really how they're conducting their business and whether that is actually improving things or causing harm. So this is why I took the very unusual step to make half of the recommendations and most of the recommendations dealing with Indigenous corrections directly to the minister. There's a provision in the Act that says that if I'm not happy with the response of the correctional services to my recommendations, that I shall, and the Corrections and Conditional Releases Act is clear, I shall notify the minister. So I think I elevated this to the minister. I met with the minister on Monday. And I must say that I was quite pleased to hear that he wouldn't take the advice from his officials and issue a response that wasn't appropriate. So he wants to take the time to consult more broadly about my recommendations and my findings, and hopefully come up with a response that will be a lot more meaningful, because as I said before, the response of the service over the years has been dismissive and unresponsive.
Thank you for that answer. My follow-up is for the Indigenous leaders gathered here. It's good to see you all. This report talks about and calls for a devolution of power and responsibility over the correctional system back to Indigenous peoples themselves. I want to ask each of you, what would that power transfer look like to you?
For Inuit, we have restorative justice systems, and we have Inuit-specific considerations within the provincial and territorial justice systems. We have historically less interaction with the federal CSC and the Act that guides federal incarceration. The Section 81 healing facility, or the facilities that were discussed, perhaps that is a place to first consider what an Inuit-specific approach would look like. In the work we are doing to implement our land claim agreements and implement self-government agreements, the administration of policing and justice and education systems is always an ongoing conversation, and the implementation of our existing rights around those areas often have partnership at the base, but also the ability to have proper funding. So in any scenario where Inuit are taking over these types of responsibilities or sharing those responsibilities where they are now solely the federal responsibility, we would have to be assured that there are sustainable resources and that there is a real approach to the same principles on why we are taking over those services, rather than in other cases, in other scenarios, just an effect of handing off a responsibility that is no longer of interest.
Thank you for the question. For a Métis-specific approach to this, we're in the works right now in the development of what that would actually look like through a number of different initiatives, including the Indigenous justice strategy and the engagements that are taking place with our Métis governments right now, as well as in the development of that justice and policing justice and community safety accord that we are negotiating right now with the Government of Canada. Ultimately, though, this is all a part of the larger effort to ensure our self-determination so that we can take care of our own people. And all of the conversations that are being had right now across the Métis Nation are surrounded by that.
Yeah, well, to add to that, I certainly concur with my colleagues, and what I would add to the reality specific to First Nations is that we have been involved for quite some time in the development of justice strategies at the regional levels, and we're sort of in the process of combining of all that into a national process. And I would add to that, obviously there needs to be assurance that, you know, there is capacity, and I think there's definitely time and space needed, but also funding. So it's very key, and I think the recommendation by the correctional investigator is very key in that area, that that needs to be supported by government. And the other point is, I think there's a definite separation or gap here between what is decided at the officials level and political level. And that has to be, in a way, corrected. And I think I'm glad to hear that the Minister of Public Safety says it important that this be addressed from his level. I think oftentimes what we see is this very divide between the bureaucrats and their bosses, really, the ministers. And it really creates a set of problems that we don't need, especially in terms of you know, the conclusions before all of us this morning. Very, very deeply concerning that instead of diminishing, that rate is rising. In this era of reconciliation, how can that happen? I mean, we have a government that says there's no relationship more important than that with Indigenous peoples, and this is this the result of it? I think Government of Canada has to be very, very concerned, and I'm really encouraging a deep, deep reflection on this.
Thank you. Next question, Fraser, APTN.
First one's for the correctional investigator. Mentions a real underutilization, I guess, of Section 81 healing lodges as opposed to state-run healing lodges. I'm just wondering if you could say first why maybe you think that is, and why it is so important, I guess, to have these Section 81 healing lodges. And if you could give the answer in French as well, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So the fact remains is currently there are 10 healing lodges. 4 are being operated by Correctional Service Canada for a total bed space of about 250. and the remaining 6 are managed by Indigenous communities. And unfortunately, there's only 139 beds. This accounts for only 2% of the Indigenous incarcerated population. So it's unfortunately not enough. And we know that those healing lodges managed by Indigenous communities actually function a lot better and are a lot more respectful of the unique needs of Indigenous people. So we think that is the way to go. We find it very upsetting that Correctional Services of Canada does not fund those Section 81 agreements appropriately. They do it at a discount, at a 40% discount. And we have to remember those healing lodges are, according to the law, they are actually minimum security penitentiaries. And they do require some skills and some investments and resources to do the job properly. So this discount is inappropriate. And what we see is that despite the low number of beds, there's still vacancies. So it's clear to me that when the Act was actually put forward in 1992, there was great deal of anticipation that this would be the appropriate way to ensure a more respectful nation-to-nation approach to federal corrections. But corrections, unfortunately, in the year 2000 decided that instead of focusing on this, they would actually put all the investment in pathways units, which are inside the walls of penitentiaries. Alors, juste pour compléter un petit peu en français.
And now just to follow up a little bit in French. There's 10 healing lodges in the country. 4 are run by Correctional Services Canada, and 6 are run by Indigenous communities. In terms of the number of beds, there are only 139 beds in Indigenous-run healing lodges. These healing lodges are not funded nearly as well as their federally run counterparts, despite having similar performance, and that's a major issue. It's not appropriate to underfund institutions that are designated in the Act as minimum security penitentiaries. So I would say that the difference in funding is problematic. And I would even say discriminatory, representative of systemic discrimination.
Questions for Regional Chief Picard. And if you could give the answer in French as well, if you don't mind. In what ways has the Correctional Services Canada reached out to, if any, to the Assembly of First Nations in terms of providing input to its programming, and I guess, and what ways, you sort of addressed this a bit in your previous answer, but in what ways should they be reaching out to the FN?
Well, I would say definitely more needs to be done in terms of getting access. I get, at my level, unofficial reports in terms of how that happens at a more local or regional level, and I think definitely there needs to be a channel to provide the kind of dialogue that's needed. But this being said, I think this report certainly would serve as a reminder that much more needs to be done in order to facilitate those channels. I think one of the conclusions from our end is that we have the right, we have the capacity to exercise the same kind of service that is provided by CSC, and to me, I think it's very important that that be acknowledged. And oftentimes we find ourselves, as I said earlier, on the sidelines. We're just really, looking over to decisions that are made about our peoples and their well-being. And to me, that's totally unacceptable. So that level of discourse and engagement has to be brought up. And I think we're certainly continue to make that point. But overall, I think we should be concerned with the findings this morning, especially in terms of the higher percentage now and the percentage of Indigenous women, which comprise half of the total population of women in federal prisons, in Canadian prisons. That's totally unacceptable in my view. So, donc, je pense qu'il y a certainement lieu de faire mieux.
So, more needs to be done in terms of establishing an ongoing dialogue with the authorities in question. This is what I'm getting from the conclusions of the report. But I'm also profoundly worried by the situation reported on, especially the proportion of Indigenous detainees throughout the country. The percentage of Indigenous people in the correctional system is far too high. Even more concerning is the fact that when you look at the population of women in Canadian prisons, Indigenous women represent half of that total. That's wildly disproportionate. I do believe that this report will serve as a reminder to bring people together when decisions are made. And speaking on behalf of AFN, we need to think of ways to reduce this overrepresentation of Indigenous people within the correctional system.
Hi, Alessia here from the Canadian Press. My question is for the correctional investigator. How concerned are you about changes to bail and how that could impact First Nations people and Indigenous people at large in the correction systems?
Well, thank you for the question. At the federal level, which is my mandate is limited to the federal level, I'm only my jurisdiction is limited to federal corrections, those that have been found guilty of and sentenced to 2 years or more. Bail, for the most part, is provincial issues, and those who are on remand or awaiting trial are in provincial custody. So I think I will pass on this. It's clear to me that whatever is decided with respect to any sort of reforms, it has to take into account whether it's going to actually perpetuate already disadvantage and discrimination patterns with respect to certain groups, including Indigenous people.
Sorry, my follow-up is for Regional Chief Picard. I'm wondering if you can give us an update on the First Nations policing and your talks with the new minister about that. What updates can you provide about that?
Well, I would start by saying You probably just heard a couple of days ago, 3 days ago, there's another complaint being filed before the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal for the underfunding of Indigenous policing services. And this is really the story. I think there's no clear engagement in terms of addressing this issue of underfunding within our policing services. And on one hand, governments say, well, we shouldn't let the courts settle the relationship or define the relationship. But yet we're given no choice but to address our complaints before the courts, and to me that's just defies any kind of logic. But I think coming back to this report this morning, I think I understand that the mandate of the investigator is very clear. But I think the whole issue of overrepresentation has to go beyond that. I think it has to touch on the relationship between existing policing services, federally, provincially, and municipal at the municipal level, and Indigenous peoples. I think it should we should go back to the cases of Chantal Moore, Rodney Levi in recent years, and I think there's definitely here an issue of relationship between law and order when it comes to Indigenous people. So I think this report has to find a way to lead us into that reflection as well. I think it's very important, and overall, it's the whole issue of justice is very broad. I mean, the whole system needs obviously is colonial in its core, and that has to change. And going back to your question, I think that latest complaint added to other ones in recent years really defines the state of matters today.
Thank you. We'll now go online. Delphine de Radio-Canada. Go ahead. Delphine, do you have a question?
Oui, est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Ok. Ma question est pour Ivan Zinger.
Interpretation services will not be provided as an appropriate headset is not being used. Interpretation will resume as soon as an appropriate headset is used.
Qui ont été mises en place depuis sa nomination.
Oui, merci.
Thank you. I believe that the appointment is still quite recent. I spoke with Miss Neal. She seems to be a very able woman. At the end of the day, what will be important is that the right attitude and resources be in place for her to carry out wholesale reforms. Instead of just handing over a problematic system. I would say that I am encouraged by the fact that after 15 years of efforts, the correctional services system has created this position. And I hope she will have the authority and the flexibility necessary to make drastic changes.
Quand vous parlez du traitement différent qui est fait
Again, interpretation services will not be provided until an appropriate headset is used.
Est-ce que vous avez un chiffre ou un pourcentage de différence salariale pour illustrer votre propos par rapport à ça?
Oui, je crois que la différence salariale.
Yes, I think that the wage difference is cited in the report. But what's even more important is that job security is just not there, especially when you compare them to their counterparts. they also do not have access, for example, to sick leave or vacation days or pensions or health benefits. Neither healthcare nor dental care.
We had. That's conclude the press conference for today. Thank you.
Yeah, it's the exact same position.